Let me ask you one question. Are you tired of having to rely on outdated and ineffective treatments for viral infections of the respiratory tract? Then look no further.
I couldn't agree more to what Colin said before, right? To this, the way of being focused, of in academia. It was always my style of working that you started with a project and you find something interesting. And particularly this project that we're working on now, this 2-deoxyglucose's activity against rhinovirus infection was something that was entirely serendipitous. So I gave a presentation on something else. Someone approached me after the talk and we started up with a project, and we were so surprised to see that this was happening with rhinoviruses, and all of a sudden we got into this field, and 10 years later we're doing a clinical study.
G.ST Antivirals is revolutionizing the way we treat these infections with its innovative host cell-based strategy to develop broad-spectrum antivirals. Join us on this episode of the Year in Review recording as we speak with the mastermind behind this groundbreaking technology, Guido Gualdoni, co-founder and CEO of G.ST Antivirals. Discover in this episode how blocking viruses' access to host cell nutrients results in complete elimination of viral reproduction, and how G.ST Antivirals approach is not only highly effective, but also unsusceptible to resistance development. Get a glimpse into the company's future plans and also the public funding and startup ecosystem in Vienna, Austria that has enabled G.ST Antivirals to thrive. Don't miss out on these exciting episodes that will change the way you think about treating viral infections. So now I'm pulling in from Austria and Germany and Argentina. It's quite an interesting history, but maybe you can... Guido, good to see you.
Hello. Hi, Christian. Hi, Colin. Good to see you.
So we have great speakers today. We had before from UCL, especially from the academic area, UCL, Kimberly Cornfield, now Colin Ewald at TH Zurich, to put it in the German way, and now Medical University from Vienna, Guido. Maybe you can say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, so thanks, Christian, for having me on the show. As I said, I'm very excited. I'm a huge fan of the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And what Colin said, it resonated a lot with my experience as a former researcher, still a bit researcher, and now CEO of a biotech company. So I'm MD, PhD by training. I was trained at the Medical University of Vienna. And while working there as a physician scientist, we were working on different aspects of the immune system. I was working mainly in immunology. And we found we did a very interesting observation that a compound that we were working with is very highly active against rhinovirus, which I hope we will talk about a bit later in a bit more detail. And eventually it ended up us patenting this compounds against rhinoviruses and starting out a company to really develop this towards the bench, towards the bedside, as you said. We're not quite at the bedside yet, but at least we're in patients already, so that's a good thing. So it has been an amazing ride so far, and we're very much looking forward to the next steps.
That's good to hear. Colin, before I forget again to drop the previous speaker off, of course you can stay and also engage in the conversation. What about you, Colin? Would you like to stay or?
I want to ask one question. One burning question I have.
Yeah, please do.
Because I heard, if I get it right, you're in Vienna, right? And so I heard Austria is really supportive with startups, and I just want to hear a little bit you're transitioning out. I mean, with the tech transfer office, you partner there. Then, is it true that they have such a great support system in Austria for young startups?
I think, like at least in my perception, in the very early stage. Once you know where to go to and where to find support, I think that's something that maybe is an area where we still can do some work, but I think there's a lot being done here in Austria. And in the very early times of founding a company, I think you get a lot of support here in Austria in terms of grant funding, in terms of networking events, in terms of even facilities. I'm currently at the startup labs from the Vienna Business Agency. So the Vienna Business Agency has labs for young companies to just plug and play, come in here and start their own labs, start their own, they have office infrastructure, etc. So actually, I would say yes. From a very young company position, it's a great place to start up. I think we are gaining momentum here in Vienna. There's a growing body of companies here, and even this critical mass is starting to establish. Serial entrepreneurs are starting to get in, and I think from this perspective, it's a very exciting city and time to start a biotech company here in Austria, and particularly in Vienna.
I couldn't agree more. I'm now in the industry, I'm in the industry since 2006 and helped bringing some companies to life. So what I see in Austria is there's a lot of support from the public side, a lot of non-dilutive grant funding that helps entrepreneurs to get off the ground. It's basically easy for scientific companies who are willing to relocate to Austria. This is the downside. The company must be incorporated in Austria, with actually the team being here in Austria. CEOs, CFOs, so the executives and the labs needs to be built here in Austria. But if that is the case, then it's easy to get 3 to 4 million euros grant funding when the topic is right and it's really a sound topic. So having said that, the downside of the Austrian community still is, which is basically the downside of all over Europe, a lack of venture capital. This is something where I think Europe can still improve. But for the grant funding side, if people are not scared away from the best city in the world when it comes to living quality, Vienna, with the downside of not having the friendliest people here in Vienna, because we are more on the lower side on that scale, Vienna is a great place to be. Highly recommend it. Yeah. If you want to explore Vienna, you can reach out to the Vienna Business Agency. Guido, you mentioned that. You can also reach out to the Austrian Business Agency. You get, I believe they will send a ton of information to you.
We sound like ambassadors of the Lisa Vienna Life Science Austria community, but it's actually, I think it's really great the support that you get here. I mean, you can come by any time just to visit the labs if you want to. It's actually, we're on a floor here where we have, I think, 12 or 13 young companies just started up in the last couple of years. So it's a very good field to develop, definitely.
Thank you. And this is really exciting to hear, right? Because I mean, I started in 2007 in New York, and I've been for 10 years at the East Coast, and there it's just a different field. And so I'm really excited that things really start to gain momentum in Europe, right? I mean, Zurich is not bad as well either. So I just want to say this as well. Yeah. But it's great that, this is coming, right? And I hope, at least from the longevity field, that we could build like a longevity valley, right? Like a Silicon Valley of longevity here in Europe, right? We could actually make it from, Basel, Zurich, Vienna. I mean, that would be a nice.
I guess what we'll all agree on is that there's a tremendous quality of scientific output here in Europe. And we do have some, something to catch up on terms of getting this to actually producing or developing products, and that actually producing innovation that ends up somewhere. But the amount of high quality science here in Europe is astonishing. And I think it's definitely worth working towards getting this more towards applied applications.
I couldn't agree more. Science-wise, it's a treasure trove. But I think the downside that we have is since 2006 and still before, that translational capital was next to not existent. And the problem is, without capital, it's impossible to train entrepreneurship and to train scientists and non-scientists into working together in a team to move science forward, because it needs a diverse skill set in a company. And I hope venture capital has become better, but there is still some room for improvement.
I'm not going to say goodbye. Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun, and I wish you happy holidays and a Gute Rutsch ins neue Jahr.
Danke, Colin.
Gleichfalls.
Colin, it was good to see you. Happy New Year. Bye.
Bye, Colin.
Guido, good to see you. Good to see you. How is your company doing?
Good to see you. Very good, actually. We're actually quite busy towards the end of the year. I think as everyone is. We have a couple of days left, and there's a ton of things that we need to finish till that date. But I hope we get some quiet days to rest as well. But in general, the team is very, very enthusiastic and highly motivated to get things done.
Let's talk about your 2022. What was your biggest success in 2022?
Well, for us, it's like from a company perspective, that's a very obvious and easy question for us to answer, because G.ST Antivirals reached clinical stage in the first quarter of 2022. We found the company in the end of 2019, so it took us a bit more than 2 years to reach clinical stage with our lead asset, our broad spectrum antiviral nasal spray. And this was obviously a very big leap forwards in our mission to develop options for antiviral treatment. So definitely for G.ST Antivirals, that was the biggest success in this year.
What is your technology doing?
Well, what we work with, so the mission of G.ST Antivirals, as I said, is to develop antivirals for viruses affecting the respiratory tract. We started out with rhinovirus, so that was the virus that I was working with together with my co-founder, Johannes Stöckel, at the Institute of Immunology at the Medical University in Vienna. So what we do is to address this virus in a sort of different way. We treat the host cell, not the virus itself. But so coming back to the very basic characteristic, I think you and everyone listening to this podcast now can say by heart, so to say, the characteristics of a virus, because we're all hobby virologists nowadays. And I think it's great, though, how well the education of the public worked in this field, at least in most of the public. So we all know that viruses are parasites per definition. They require the host cell to replicate, right? So they need every single molecule, every single protein, every single nucleotide. They need to grasp it from the host cell. And viruses, within a very short time frame, produce millions of progeny, so to say. And this is a highly anabolic state, so they need a lot of molecules to reproduce, which is not normal for a cell, right? To have such a high biosynthesis going on. So what viruses evolved during their the last couple of million years is to actually force the cell to take up more nutrients. Actually, kind of a very basic or so to say intuitive thing to do, right? They need a lot of nutrients. They force the cell. They have shaped strategies to force the cell to take up more nutrients. And what we do is that we impair this process, and by very simply just stopping this high nutrient ingestion, we stop the virus from replicating. And that doesn't only apply to rhinovirus, which is the first one that we found this process to be very important, but it also applies to coronaviruses very importantly, and to other viruses of the respiratory tract. So our technology protects the metabolism of the host cell and therefore prevents the viruses to replicate. And we have different technologies coming out of this approach. The most advanced one, as I said before, is a broad spectrum antiviral nasal spray that is currently being tested in a phase 1. Luckily here in Vienna as well. So we have the whole, so to say, value generation from really finding the concept, finding the first compound that works, and really applying it to the first volunteers here in Vienna, which I think is a great success story for what you can do here in the city, and what can be achieved, if you set up to actually do things and develop the product.
No, absolutely. Bringing a product into the clinics is a huge success for a company. What was your biggest learning in this year with moving your company forward as an entrepreneur?
Well, as I said before, I'm a first-time entrepreneur. I'm an MD, PhD by training, so everything business related is new to me. as Colin said before, there's a lot of things to learn once you start a company. But I would say business-wise, the very basic I had to learn before 2022. There's still tons of business related aspects when assessing the market, etc. that I'm still learning. But I would still say, setting up a clinical trial for the first time, there's something called the Optimism bias. I think you have Daniel Kahneman there in the back, which is that entrepreneurs are very prone to, and I think that I'm a very so to say very prone to this optimism bias as well. I'm far too optimistic, and I need to learn to plan a bit more down to earth, so to say. That were the things to be learned this year. But luckily, it was still, everything went good enough to move forward very good. So,
haven't you inhaled the Viennese spirit yet?
That everything's bad, you mean?
Everything's bad. It can't get any more terrible. Is this really such a problem, optimism bias? To be
I think
too optimistic?
I think that there's, a certain probably degrees of optimism bias, right? I mean, I think you do, as particularly Daniel Kahneman wrote in his book, nobody would ever start a company if there wasn't an optimism bias. I think most of us are optimists when starting a company, because otherwise you would never do it. And I think you definitely need these optimists to try to push projects forwards that don't have a very high likelihood to succeed, right? We all know the success rates of startups and of clinical development programs that start out. Nonetheless, it's your big shot to make a big impact on the world, right? So it's still important to try, and through the difficulties that are implied into the whole process, I think it's very important to still push forward. But nonetheless, you need to balance it a bit and look around what's actually achievable in which time frames and how much money you need for it to be successful in the end. I think it's just a learning story for young entrepreneurs to get a bit of their optimism bias a bit weakened in the course of starting up.
Yeah, I think it's the difference that might be a challenge between vision and reality and plans and milestones. And when I think about with Albert, we spoke about Theranos. They were a little bit more on the, I think Sebastian Malaby wrote in his book, premature truth. So it's a little bit creative and too optimistic towards the approach. Couldn't agree more. Colin mentioned the difference between the two mindsets, business and research mindset. How do you see that? Is this similarities and differences?
I couldn't agree more to what Colin said before, right? To this, the way of being focused in academia, it was always my style of working that you started with a project and you find something interesting. And particularly this project that we're working on now, this 2-deoxyglucose activity against rhinovirus infection was something that was entirely serendipitous. So I gave a presentation on something else. Someone approached me after the talk, and we started up with a project, and we were so surprised to see that this was happening with rhinoviruses. And all of a sudden we got into this field, and 10 years later, we're doing a clinical study. So in academia, obviously you something looks interesting and you dig into it, and it's I always used to refer to the university as a playing ground, right? You have all of the space you need to just develop ideas, to talk after work, to, go into the lab and just try stuff. And that was an amazing time. I mean, I'm still very highly supportive of everyone who wants to start a PhD and go into research. I think it's a very valuable thing to do. And so we had this transition from actually, playing around, being curious to find things, to actually, being full focused on moving this project forward. And this was obviously a transition to us. But I think since I think we talked about it last week, we're very heavily goal oriented. So we all have this goal in our head to, we want to have this product on the market we want to see that it works. We want to see people using it. All of the people, particularly now in this season, are approaching me that we need something against viruses. It's that we have the Robert Koch Institute in Germany just released the numbers that we have 9.5 million German people sick. So more than 10% of the population in Germany is currently sick with respiratory tract infections. Me, myself, I was in the hospital yesterday with my son because he had a respiratory tract infection. So we have we have an abundance of these things. And even though we get used to it now with COVID and all, I think there's still a huge medical need to get this problem solved for humankind. And we have this goal in front of us. And so we learn to be focused and to go rather into development instead of only research. And the research was very focused on the development that we wanted to do. It was a transition, but it was paying off so far very well. Now we allow ourselves to look into things that are maybe also just interesting to us and might end up in a product. But it's definitely in transition, and it makes sense to do one thing at the university and another thing at the company.
Is it? How is it for you? I mean, you are both a successful entrepreneur and a scientist. How challenging is it for you to unite creativity, the scientific creativity, where you said sometimes you see something and you just follow the novelty, compared to your entrepreneurial mindset, where you say, okay, now we focus on the mission and we just do that mission. And when something new pops up, we just don't look in this direction. How challenging is this for you to balance that?
Well, I don't think that it's too difficult for me. Actually, I would say that it's far more difficult for our chief scientific officer, for
Really?
Thea, that you already also know. Yeah. But as I said, I'm very, very oriented towards getting this one product done, and I think it will enable so much further if we get this through the finishing line. So I'm kind of very focused on this one, but I do have other issues when it comes to all of a sudden being an entrepreneur. I know that sometimes I talk too scientific when I talk to people that are not from the field or not even from the area, not even from biomedicine, but from a totally different area. So I think that you need to learn a certain way of talking, a certain way of thinking, this milestone-driven approach that you mentioned before. So it's not just about the paper, it's about milestones to get money to get the next milestones. And this is a very new way of thinking. And it never ends, right? So you have an academic publication and then you have a product done, right? But in a company field, you always have the next milestone that you need to reach. Maybe at the end of the day, everything ends up being successful, but it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? And it's and this is sort of also sometimes the things that I'm struggling with, but it's not so much the not being curious anymore.
Yeah, the normal lifetime for a company is forever. So basically, it's an infinite game when people play it in the sense of business and not a finite game. I think it's a huge difference. And very often I see in businesses that they just run on a finite game mindset and not this infinite mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree that the time frames are very long, right? So we need to be prepared to be committed for many years before you actually see the fruits of your work.
Oh yeah, that's true. I think the biggest success, when I think back on the last recession, I think WhatsApp started, Facebook a few years ago, earlier Uber started, but they all needed about 10 years to fruition. So it's a minimum time to when somebody starts a company to really.
And in drug development, it's even worse, right? I mean, you have this very big time frames, a lot of regulatory things you have to deal with to actually move to the next stage. So it's people working in IT or other industries are often very astonished by the fact that we actually, in the kind of timeframes that are attached to our kind of work, right, in life sciences. So
that's true.
But it's okay. You need to still celebrate the small successes, like reaching clinical stage, a set of experiments that worked out, a patent that got granted. Need to learn to live off these sort of successes, right?
That's true. That's true. When we look towards the future, where do you see your part of the industry heading to in future?
Well, that's an amazing question. I have to say, because I work in anti-infectives, which is incredibly dynamic. That has been incredibly dynamic the last couple of years. So it's very difficult to say where also the consumer interest is going to end up, right? Because now we had COVID, and we had a lot of people interested in anti-infectives. Actually, an area that wasn't too interesting for the pharmaceutical industry before. But all of a sudden, we had this very high public interest in the sector of anti-infectives, and this kind of goes on because now we have a huge waves of the flu and of non-COVID respiratory tract infections, and people are very aware that that more work needs to be done here to help us to clear these infections. But it's so dynamic. I think that it will continue, like the awareness that we need drugs that combat virus infections will be here for the next couple of years. I think that there's a fundamental change into how we conceive viral infections, that this is something that is here to stay for the next couple of years. And therefore, I think that is a good way, good area to thrive in for the next couple of years and to move our programs further. G.ST Antivirals is definitely looking towards finishing the phase 1 and then moving towards the next clinical steps. We're very excited to actually move into proof of concept studies with our compound, and to start the next preclinical program. That's actually something that we're super excited about 2023, combined with this persistent interest in anti-infectives. I think it's a perfect situation for us to move forward.
You said you start a new program in 2023?
Yeah, we're kind of establishing or putting together so that like the follow-on project to the, as I said, we were very focused on moving this one asset further towards clinical development. And now we want to actually, because we think that this is a very great way to tackle virus infections, as I said. It's this host cell-based treatment that impedes or inhibits the viruses from accessing the biomolecule of the host cell, is something that doesn't result in any resistance development. It's very broad spectrum. It's active against a lot of different respiratory tract viruses, and therefore we think it would be a waste to let it only, be with one nasal spray. We want to actually help people with lower respiratory tract infections. As you know, people suffering from COPD, from asthma, from cystic fibrosis, from lung transplantations, all of these vulnerable groups that have now been talked about so much during the COVID pandemic, that were the groups that we're protecting with the lockdowns, with the vaccines, with the antiviral drugs that are out there. All of these groups, they suffer so much from rhinovirus infections, from endemic coronavirus infections, parainfluenza, the flu, and they have options, but they're obviously don't end up in a very sufficiently treated state. Still, a lot of people suffering from COPD end up dying from viral respiratory tract infections. And having this technology in our hands, this new way of approaching viruses, we think it's definitely worth pursuing, helping these patient populations. And that's the next thing that we're going to be looking at.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the lockdowns had the upside of having less infections generally in the population. You also saw in the last 2 years with flus or usual infections that didn't have any problem.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, lockdowns have some unpleasant side effects like high inflation and disruptions of supply chains. So it's not a solution for society, I guess, on the long run. Having something like you develop, I think that helps people avoiding infections in the first place is a great thing when it works and when it comes to the market, hopefully. So this would be...
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, we're working as hard as we can on it. There's very few people going on vacation over the holidays, so you can count on us to develop as fast as possible.
No, I had I'm 48 now. I had some severe infections already in my life, and it's no fun. So having something, I mean, a light common cold is easy, but it's not fun. But when it's not impossible to breathe properly, it's really difficult.
Yeah, we always think of the common cold as the self-limiting disease that affects, like if you're a healthy person, then it's mainly some days in bed, but also actually symptomatic treatment, as you say, is also not ideal because you have to stop using it. You get addicted to the decongestants. So not getting sick in the first place is probably a very good thing for a lot of people, particularly people like me with kids in kindergarten that are exposed to respiratory viruses all the time. They get approached by parents all the time and to develop faster. But also,
go ahead. We want to see it on the market.
We have a lot of patient populations that are currently insufficiently treated with very severe diseases that need additional options, and that motivates us to continue as fast as possible.
Guido, let's pull the next speaker in. He's already in the waiting room, Thomas Schubert.
Did we already talk for half an hour?
Time flies. This is the reason why I usually talk for 1 to 2 hours to cover the topics properly. Half an hour is not very much on the podcast, especially with speakers like you, Colin, Kimberly. It's so easy to have a nice conversation. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Beginner's Mind podcast. I hope you found the information and insights shared by Guido Gualdoni, CEO of G.ST Antivirals, valuable and intriguing. If you enjoyed this episode, please show your support by liking, leaving a comment, and sharing it with others. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on our future episodes. Your support helps the team to reach more people who can benefit from the content and join the podcast community of innovators and biotech enthusiasts. Thank you for being a part of our journey towards discovering the latest advancements in the field of biomedical research. Have a great day.